Looks good. Looks like it's got a good picture. All right. So welcome everyone. This is our third class in this series on the four immeasurables. Let me go ahead and share the prayers. And Jana, I assume you're going to do the honors of leading us in those. Let me get those on the screen. Okay. Let me move this up out of the way or down here. It might be better. Yeah.
Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times in English. To the founder,
the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge.
Short mandala offering once in Tibetan. Saji po ki
Juk Shing Me Tok Cham Ri Rab Ling Shi Ni De Gyan Pa Di Sangye Shin Tu Mik Te U Wari Dokunam Dakshin Ba Choparsho Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamiryatayami.
Refuge and bodhicitta once in English, twice in Tibetan. I
Go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Sangye
Chodang Soki Choknam La, Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi, Daki Chunyen Gi Pe Sonam Gi, Drola Penchir Sangye Druparsho. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La, Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi, Daki Chunyen Gi Pe Sonam Gi, Drola Penchir Sangye Druparsho. Okay, thank you, Jana. Thank you all for joining in the prayers. Let's do a meditation. As I mentioned previously in the earlier classes, we're going to do a meditation on each of the measurables. The measurable joy we'll just do a bit at the end of the final class next week, but today we'll do a meditation on immeasurable love. Not a long one, but at least to reacquaint ourselves with the main points of that. So find a good meditation posture, and we'll begin with just a few minutes of silent meditation, watching the breath. Just try to bring your awareness to the breath in whatever technique you prefer to use. And whenever you see that the mind has wandered, Let go of whatever distracted you and gently bring the mind back to the breath. So now, as we did last week, we're going to begin by visualizing all beings surrounding us. We can't possibly bring to mind all sentient beings, but at least create this visualization as best as we can, starting with those who are very close to us, dear to us. So you can have the mother of this life on your left, the father on the right, and then the other beings who we're quite close to in the space to either side and behind us, our friends, pets, other family members, those who we already feel some regard for, some concern for. And then in the space immediately in front of us are those who we are opposed to. Again, we can refer to these as enemies, difficult people. It might be people that you know who have harmed you, or even those that you love. Or it can be those beings that we know of in the world who we find irritating, annoying, challenging. That try to bring to mind these two groups in particular that are much more specific for us. We should have faces that go with these two groups, those that oppose us, those that have befriended us. And then in the space surrounding ourselves in those two groups are countless other beings who are strangers. And we can visualize them all in human form just to make it easier. But this vast ocean of beings going out in all directions in the space around us, countless beings who in this life at least are strangers. We can remind ourselves of the mind of equanimity. We want to free ourselves of the bias that we currently have of attachment towards the friends, aversion, anger towards the enemies, and the indifference we have towards the countless strangers. By seeing that all these beings are equal in their desire to be happy, their wish to not suffer. Just like us, they are driven by those fundamental needs. We can just hold that awareness for a moment before we begin our meditation on immeasurable love. So to cultivate immeasurable love, we're going to use some of the thoughts that are in general around all beings. We're not going to look at them specifically in these three groups, but we might observe our kind of using these reasonings, these thoughts, and see what kind of effect it does have in regard to each of these three groups. So the very first one is that we need these beings, and they are incredibly kind to us in giving us an opportunity to practice what will lead to our happiness, initially through our temporal happiness. If we're going to be generous and practice that in this life, we need other beings that are the recipients of our generosity. This is how we create the causes for our future happiness in having resources and so on, is through practicing generosity. If we're going to want to experience good health, a long life, well, then we need to practice the virtue of not killing. And for that, we need sentient beings that are the basis for that action. Any virtuous action we engage in pretty much entails not harming other beings, and moreover, trying to help them. So first, to kind of increase this feeling of closeness and concern for others, think about how they are incredibly kind in being a basis for all of our practice of engaging in virtue. We need those beings. In that way, they are kind. We can secondly think about the fact that in this life, we depend upon others for everything we need pretty much. We might think we're really quite skilled at being self-sufficient, but we depend upon the kindness of other beings to produce the clothes that we wear, the roads we drive on, the cars that we drive in, the houses we live in, all the things that bring us some measure of comfort, happiness. We absolutely depend upon others. In this way, we can begin to feel some concern for these beings because they have been incredibly kind to us in that way. And then lastly, the greatest kindness that these beings can show us is by being a support for the development of our full potential. And when we generate the mind of bodhicitta that we'll be doing shortly, we need all beings as the basis for that mind. We strive to become a Buddha to benefit each and every one of them without exception. In this way, every being is intimately involved with our own welfare, helping us to achieve our greatest potential, the state of Buddhahood. So again, this is another way that we can see the kindness of others, not just being a support for our practice of virtue, not just being involved in our lives by producing the things that bring us some measure of happiness, but moreover by being the basis, the support for our entire spiritual path, all the way to enlightenment. You cannot become a Buddha without these suffering sentient beings, these kind sentient beings. So reflect on that reality. Try to help that cultivate this feeling of closeness and concern for all three groups of beings. And then begin to generate thoughts of loving kindness towards these beings, seeing how incredibly kind they are in these ways that we've just reflected on. You can generate this in terms of the four measurable thoughts. The first one of how wonderful it would be if every one of these beings, whether they're a friend, enemy, or stranger, were to have happiness and the causes of happiness, in particular, the greatest possible state of well-being and happiness, complete Buddhahood. How wonderful that would be. And again, try this on in regard to each of these three groups. How does it feel to generate that thought? First towards friends, then towards strangers. And if you can, even generate that thought towards the difficult people in your life. And then advance this thought, thinking, may they have happiness and its causes. May they achieve Buddhahood, the complete bliss of that state. May this come to pass. And then finally, the thought that really strengthens these into the Mahayana motivation, thinking, I myself will do this for them. I will place them in happiness, all the causes of happiness. Even if it is by myself alone, I will do this for them. I will bring them to the peerless bliss of Buddhahood. Every single sentient being without exception. And then we can invoke the presence of our gurus, the Buddhas, especially in the form of Chenrezig, the Buddha of compassion, and seek the blessings of the Buddhas to be able to do this, to be able to bring sentient beings, each and every one of them, to their full potential, to complete Buddhahood, and all the happiness that precedes that, the temporal happiness that gives them the opportunity to practice the Dharma, and to develop that all the way to the ultimate happiness of complete enlightenment, Buddhahood. Please bless me to be able to do this. And then we cultivate the mind of bodhicitta that has that as one of its main thoughts, the wish to bring all beings to the happiness that they seek, and the intention to become enlightened ourselves so we can accomplish that for others. Without our attainment of enlightenment, we can't possibly bring them to that state. So we generate bodhicitta, the wish to become a Buddha, so we can help all sentient beings to achieve their greatest potential. And we'll open our eyes fully, and I'll put on the microphone. Sorry, John, I forgot it. Okay. There. It's loud now. I think John thought I had the microphone on and that it wasn't working. Sorry, John. I thought about putting it on then, but I was kind of not wanting to interrupt the meditation too much. But so any questions on immeasurable love? Again, we just reviewed kind of those main points that are in the handout that I gave you that work with kind of seeing all beings in this more general way. Recall that there are techniques for working with each of the groups and seeing the kindness of friends, of course, it's very obvious, the kindness of strangers, the kindness of even the people that are difficult for us. We can see them as giving us an opportunity to deepen our patience, our concern for others. That's up to us, of course. You know, from their side, they might keep doing all the horrible things they're doing towards us. So no questions or comments on that? Did anything come up in your meditation? Hopefully you had a chance to work with that over the last week. Okay, then let's go. We do have one. Yes, please, Bill.
Question. Notice in each of those, verses, it mentions, I myself will bring these people to enlightenment. And that just is, it's kind of a strange feeling to me, that statement. And I don't know, like, I will do it. That's kind of how it sounds to me. I'm sure that's probably not.
Well, and again, the reality is that we ourselves cannot really bring every being to enlightenment, because we might not even have the karmic connections with some beings. Even when you attain Buddhahood, it said that some beings you just don't have the karma to benefit. We even have that phrase sometimes, may I benefit all the beings not benefited by the Buddhas of the past, or something. So there is this, we are making a pretty highfalutin motivation there of like, all beings, I will take them all to enlightenment. And we even have that thought sometimes, like I mentioned, even if it is by myself alone, even if I have to take responsibility for every single sentient being. But the reality is that you don't have to take responsibility for every being in the fact of the actual playing out of that. But we have to generate that level of mind. I mean, when we get to bodhicitta, and we'll talk about bodhicitta next week and how these all feed into bodhicitta. I won't mention this next week probably then, but there are 3 levels of our bodhicitta. These are kind of the ways that we advance this mind so that it becomes very courageous. They're almost really 3 levels of courage, because that's a pretty outrageous mind, right? I'm going to become a Buddha to benefit all beings, to take them all to that state. The very first one is what's called kind of the ship captain like bodhicitta. I'm sorry, the ruler like bodhicitta. That's the first one. If you're a ruler of a domain, as a king or a queen or whatever, well, then you have the ability to benefit everyone who's in the kingdom in that domain, right? So that's the idea that we're usually cultivating, right? May I become a Buddha, may I become the ruler, so I can then help all sentient beings. That's the first one, and that's kind of the easiest one for us to get our heads around to some degree. The second level of courage is the ship's captain like, where we want to bring all beings to enlightenment with us. We're all going to get in the boat at the same time and arrive at the destination at the same time. I mean, the logistics of that are a little beyond my understanding, but nonetheless, that's a little more courageous, right? I'm going to forego my own enlightenment to at least achieve enlightenment with everyone else. We'll all have a big Buddha party at the end, right? We'll all achieve Buddhahood together, everyone included, right? And again, that's a little more courageous, because it doesn't mean we're going to kind of get there first and then bring people there. It's going to go when everyone else goes. The most courageous is the shepherd-like bodhicitta. If you know shepherds or shepherdesses, they tend to their flock first, right? They get the flock where they need to be, and especially in the evening when they want to make sure they're protected from wolves or whatever else might be out there that could be of harm to them. They put all of their concern and effort into tending to the flock, and then they will retire themselves. Then they will take care of themselves. So the idea here is that you want to have that mind. That's said to be the strongest of these three minds, but it's impossible to do that. As I was saying in the motivation, we have to become a Buddha to be able to take others to that same state. You have to take care of yourself in the end first before you can bring everyone else to enlightenment. But it's the most courageous thought to think, I will take them all there first, and then I will become a Buddha. I'll let them all become a Buddha first. And that way they're kind of taken care of, and then I can sort of retire myself. Again, it's pretty outrageous thought, and that's a pretty courageous way of going about it. And it's kind of encapsulated to some degree in that wonderful verse from Master Shantideva that we frequently use. For as long as space exists, as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. Of course, it doesn't say as a sentient being or as an enlightened being, but the idea is that there is some of that bodhisattva ethic that's often taught in many of the Mahayana traditions, of like you want to stay behind and get everyone to enlightenment first. But it's impossible to do that. We're not skilled as ordinary beings to take them to enlightenment. You need to be enlightened in order to guide beings to that state. So again, this is just on your comment, Bill. I mean, this idea that we're trying to adopt here of may I be the cause to do that. I myself will do that for others. That's, this impetus to kind of channel our energy into becoming more qualified to be able to benefit others. Bodhicitta is a pretty outrageous mind. It's not for the faint-hearted. So again, we just have to nurture that over time. And when we try it on, let me go ahead and put the verses on the screen. I realized at the first class I said we recite them at each of the classes, but we haven't really been doing that much, I don't think. But again, when we go to immeasurable love, we have that right there. I myself will cause them to have happiness and its causes. Well, by becoming a Buddha, we can then skillfully guide others, knowing their minds, knowing their predispositions, to encounter what will lead them on that path, excuse me, of attaining happiness and finding the causes of happiness. I mean, look at the way that our masters, our gurus, have helped us in that, progress towards achieving greater happiness through teaching us good morality, through teaching us how to develop concentration, teaching us how to develop greater insight into the reality of things. Again, all of this comes about because we are under the guidance of these enlightened beings, helping us to attain that state. So we want to do the same for others. We want to be able to be their guiding light, to be their savior in a sense. Again, it's not quite the same as what we talk about as a savior in some of these other traditions, but that's what the Buddhas can do for us. Is that when you are a Buddha, you then can guide others perfectly, skillfully to attaining the same state. So I don't know if that helped a little bit, Bill, but we just try it on. I mean, with that third line, you're just kind of trying on that mind state of I myself doing this. Again, it's outrageous thought, but we have to kind of get there somehow. So, any other comments? Anything more on that, Bill? No? Okay. All right. Then let's go forward. Tonight's topic is immeasurable compassion. Maybe what we'll do is we'll at least recite the verse for immeasurable compassion. I'll put that up on the screen. Maybe in the final class we'll do these all four of these, but we could recite this together. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they be free of suffering and its causes. I myself will cause them to be free of suffering and its causes. Please, Guru Deity, grant me blessings to be able to do this. So again, every one of these has the same 4-line format. The first 3 where we're really working on these, advancing these thoughts in ourselves. And then the 4th one where we seek the blessings, again, of our gurus, of the Buddhas, especially again, Chenrezig, the Buddha of compassion that I mentioned earlier, that has the 4 arms, and we can see that as kind of the embodiment of these 4 measurables. So compassion is obviously a really important quality on the path and something that we all have to some degree. By the way, is it going back and forth between the screen and that here in the Gompa? I can't see the screen.
It has been, yes.
It has been. Okay, good. Because sometimes with the other computer, it would do kind of weird things. So So again, compassion is often said to be the root of bodhicitta. We'll talk about this a little bit next week because compassion has a very different feeling to it than loving kindness, right? Loving kindness, we kind of feel warm and fuzzy inside when we're generating thoughts of love towards others, right? That is the tendency in that state of mind. Compassion is a different animal, right? It's looking at the suffering of other beings. These are kind of the flip side of beings. We can see their desire for happiness and kind of focusing on that and wanting them to have that. And then we can see their desire to be free from suffering and addressing that and trying to be attentive to ways that will alleviate the suffering of others. Obviously, these two are very much tied in with each other. To have some measure of happiness means having some freedom from suffering. When we have freedom from suffering, we definitely attain some measure of happiness. So these two are feeding into each other very much. But compassion has a different kind of, it's a much more palpable emotion in some regard than loving kindness, in my estimation. I always put that question out when I teach on compassion, like, why do you think they really highlight compassion as the root of bodhicitta and as the root of so much of our progress on the spiritual path? And I think it's because it does have that kind of quality. When you're looking at the suffering of others, it feels very different. It's more visceral. It kind of gets at this deep connection that we can have to others through our sorrow and through our understanding what suffering is. And every being, of course, has the seeds of compassion. Many beings become very hardened to it. Remember how I've been introducing what we call the far enemy and the near enemies, sometimes plural. But in regard to, of course, loving kindness, we had the near enemy being when we have a strong feeling of affection towards a being, but it's together with attachment. It's our kind of delusion of attachment playing out in regard to wanting that being to be happy because it's infused with the thought so that they can make me happy. It's so, that's what the mind of attachment does. The far enemy of loving kindness is hatred, is the mind that hates beings, that is not concerned about their welfare at all and might even do things to harm other beings. For compassion, the far enemy is cruelty. We know beings can be even born with aspects of cruelty. Look at some young children who might have no hesitation about treating other kids bad or treating animals, like they're rocks or something. I mean, throwing them around and stepping on them and doing all sorts of mean things to sentient beings. I mean, that's a pattern that can play out in beings, but it's not cast in stone. Cruelty can be overcome. It does take sometimes some very special causes and conditions for that to happen. But any being we see in the world who is cruel has simply armored their heart so much that they aren't able to manifest that compassion in a more general way. But they probably still have some places where compassion plays out. Maybe they have their own pets that they might be very concerned about, or those very dear people to them that they might be able to be somewhat, concerned about their suffering. But, cruelty can be really hard to see when people are in that state. But that's the far enemy. The near enemy to compassion has two aspects to it. I want to introduce these because I think it's important before we go into generating compassion and the thoughts that cultivate that, to really examine how we can miss the mark. Remember, these near enemies are close to it, but they've gone astray. The first one is pity. And again, pity, when we see it playing out in terms of people's behavior, has a feeling of superiority, right? Oh, poor you down there in your low position. I will throw something at you to help you out a little bit or whatever. With pity, we are infusing it with, again, still a bit more about ourselves in terms of where we are in relationship to that being and feeling magnanimous in our generosity or whatever we're doing to help those poor beings down there that are suffering. Well, of course, the antidote to pity is to meditate more on equanimity, how we're in the same boat as those beings. And of course, if we take into consideration countless lifetimes, we've been in probably worse positions than that being that we might feel like helping, at that time. We've been, in every dire condition that's ever existed in the world, probably, right? Because we've had countless lifetimes. So we have to kind of level that out and say, there but for the grace of karma go I, kind of thing. That's kind of a play on that. There but for the grace of God go I. There was a wonderful little cartoon that I saw once that had a homeless person sitting on the sidewalk, and a man in a suit coming by and kind of looking at him. And the man who was unhoused was holding a mirror. And so that's kind of what we need to see, is that when we look at someone who's in that situation that we consider to be unfortunate, that we see it as that could be ourselves. Really, there is no difference between that being there that needs help in that way and myself. We're both in the same fundamental predicament. So we don't want to have a mind of pity when we're cultivating compassion, where we're looking down on others or generating those kinds of thoughts of superiority and them being inferior. And of course, this plays out a lot in our world. We can see how oftentimes that's the attitude that beings have when they're doing charity work, what have you. And we want to try to be with others as much as we can at the same level as them. So if you're volunteering to go help with those who are unhoused and help, sit down and be with them. Don't, look kind of, oh, well, how wonderful of me to kind of throw some food at you and give you an opportunity, to be served or whatever. Think that it's really about them. You really want to identify with them. The other one that's really kind of interesting is sometimes it's called overwhelm. Pema Chodron, when she talks about it, because he's actually come from a text by Kamala Sheila, she says the literal translation of the words that are used for this is horrified anxiety. Horrified anxiety or overwhelm happens when we are identifying too much with the suffering of others and we feel like we can't take that on. The suffering is too great. I mean, this happens, right? Just look at the pictures that have been coming out of Gaza recently of these children who are just on the verge of death, right? I mean, they're one meal away from death, essentially. If they got some food, they might be able to be sustained in some regard. I mean, this is really hard to be with that type of suffering, right? And we can feel the sense of overwhelm, of helplessness, of just kind of, oh, I can't deal with it anymore. Well, again, that is something that isn't a proper mode of compassion because it's not kind of staying more actively engaged in it. And it also becomes very much about me, about my feelings and my inability to be with that. I mean, I know that a lot of people euthanize their pets. This is one example. But oftentimes we euthanize our pets not out of a concern for the suffering of the animal, but of our own horrified anxiety, our own inability to stay present with the suffering of another being. It is hard to be with the suffering of another. That's actually what compassion means. It means to suffer with. Compatio or whatever, compati, I think is the Latin root. Never studied Latin, but it's kind of interesting when you go back to these Latin roots and you see what the real meaning of the words are. It means I'm going to suffer with you. I'm going to be with you, have an empathy that identifies with what's going on with you, that doesn't feel overwhelmed. Again, so these two are, sometimes we identify that as I'm being quite compassionate when I've got that pity look on another being and helping them, or when I just feel like, oh, I'm taking it all in and it just becomes this very heavy duty thing. But it kind of loses its more responsive kind of tone to it. I've done some teachings before and actually received in a course that I took, went into some understanding of what we mean by balanced empathy. Some of you may have heard teachings on this before. Empathy, of course, is what draws us into feeling the pain of another being. It's the root of compassion. If you can't feel the suffering of another being, if you've kind of hardened your own heart or armored your own heart to where you're not going to let that in at all, where you can be cruel perhaps or whatever, well, then, compassion isn't going to rise. It's based on empathy. Empathy means that I'm going to take my mind state and try to see what you are experiencing, to have that empathic connection with another being. So empathy has two elements to it. One is that feeling with, that where we're really kind of identifying with the suffering of another that can become overwhelmed really quickly. That's usually called affective, affective, affective empathy, because we need that. And of course, when we're on the receiving end of empathy from another, we need them to identify with our suffering, right? To some degree, that's otherwise they're cold. They're not really getting it, that we're in dire need of help at that time, right? Our situation is not good. And so when we're with another and we have a lack of effective empathy, well, then they're going to feel it right away. Like, what are you doing here? You don't even care about what's going on with me. So that's an important part of it. The second part of it is called cognitive empathy, which is what is lacking if we go overboard on the affective, if it becomes this sense of overwhelm, right? Because you need a cognitive component to it where you are saying, okay, and what do I do to address this suffering? How do I actually work with this? Because the person at the time who's suffering is probably not capable of completely working with it. That's why you're there as a source of compassion and concern for them. When we did this workshop, we used examples like if you had somebody whose house was just robbed, they come home for the evening and they walk in and their whole house has been ransacked and a lot of things missing, whatever, and they call you on the phone and they say, I won't believe what's happened. I got home and my house has been robbed. And you say, okay, I'll be over there in a minute. And so we actually played these out with like the extremes when it's out of balance, where you have somebody who's just like sitting there crying with the other person for 15 minutes. That doesn't do much good for the person who's going through it, right? I mean, it feels good to have them identify with it, but it's not their suffering, it's your suffering. So again, that's the same thing here. We have to recognize that it's their suffering, the suffering of these beings, and we want to be attentive to it. We don't want to get drowned in it, which is what this mind of overwhelm is. On the other hand, you can play the extreme of being the total cognitive one, right? Where all you do is you come in and you're not really, your heart isn't involved. These are kind of heart and head sort of things, right? If your heart isn't involved in it and you're really not connecting with the suffering of another being, well, then you're missing the mark in that regard. And you might be really good at saying, oh, well, have you called the police? And did you take an inventory of what needs to, what's missing and da da da. Like you do all these things that are about trying to address the situation, but you're not really feeling what the other person's feeling. Good empathy has both components. It has a recognition of the suffering of that being and a wish to be with them, to have that affective empathy that really feels what they're going through, but not get overwhelmed and keep the cognitive component there so that you can actually do things to help others. It's really quite interesting. One researcher has said that this whole concept we have in our culture of compassion burnout isn't really compassion burnout, it's empathy burnout, because people are too much in the affective empathy, where they're really identifying so much with the suffering of the beings that they're serving. I'm sure, like, remember when COVID started and so many of the nurses, doctors, what have you, on the front line were having to be with patients who, most of them dying, and no time to process any of this, right? Just this overwhelm of the suffering of others and an inability to do anything really on the cognitive side that would make a huge difference. They could try to tend to people as best as they could and what have you, but so again, we can see how these play out, and they're really the root of compassion. And I like to teach on them when I talk about compassion because we don't really think about empathy that much in different facets of empathy. We might think it has kind of a similar flavor regardless of where we're at or what we're doing. So again, let me go ahead and share on the screen the comments from Kathleen McDonald in her book. This is in your handout as well on the sheet for compassion. Compassion arises out of our own experience of suffering. We all know what it's like to be sick or in pain, to be lonely, or have our feelings hurt by an unkind remark, to fear the unknown or grieve the death of a loved one. When we then see or hear of others going through similar experiences, our heart opens with a feeling of empathy and the wish to help. This is compassion, the wish for oneself and others to be free of suffering, free from all painful, unwanted, satisfactory experiences. It acknowledges that everyone wants to be free of suffering, deserves to be free, and has the capacity to be free. So again, empathy and compassion are not identical, but if you don't have a grounding in empathy, then the compassion is, again, going to probably look more like pity, perhaps, or as something else. But again, keep in mind that that other extreme where we identify too much with the suffering of others is more of an empathic kind of imbalance rather than our compassion not being more genuine. So let me see, what other comments do I want to make? I want to just remind us that, when it comes to talking about suffering, and we're going to go into more detail on suffering as part of tonight, that this is where the Buddha started in his teachings, right? The very first discourse that he gave was the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. And one of the first utterances out of his mouth was that the nature of existence is unsatisfactory. He used the word dukkha. Dukkha has been translated constantly as suffering, and I even have it in my translation of the addendum, the second addendum that I put together for compassion, looking at the varieties of suffering. I use suffering there, but oftentimes when I teach on it, I like to avoid that word, especially with new people who might go, but I'm not suffering. Right now I feel fine. Nothing's going on that's that traumatic. Well, that's because when we talk about the word dukkha, it has much more that it involves than just what we call suffering in our culture. Any one of us right now might think, oh no, I'm not suffering, I'm fine. Go help those who are suffering in another way, right? So it's important that we get clear about what we really mean by suffering or dukkha. But this is a reality. This was the Buddha's first observation, that birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, illness is dukkha, death is dukkha. All of these things that we experience in our lives are unsatisfactory. And of course, when we talk about developing the deepest level of compassion, we are concerned about every way that beings are dealing with unsatisfactoriness, not just the more overt ways that they are experiencing that. So I do want to go into the various levels of dukkha as part of tonight to, really clarify what we are looking at when we are working with this. Maybe I'll actually start there because I think it's kind of useful to talk about suffering. I'm actually teaching the module on samsara and nirvana for the folks in San Francisco. So one whole class we spent looking at dukkha and all the various. So this is, again, in your packet as well that I put together for you, the addendum 2, points for meditation on the suffering of sentient beings. In this meditation, we can recall the various types of suffering that are presented in the Buddha's teachings, again, or dukkha, in order to enhance our compassionate wish to free all beings from all of these without exception. So we see that our initial feelings of compassion are generally going to arise on the basis of the more evident, manifest forms of suffering or dukkha. And that's okay. That's a touchstone that will help us kind of get into that place of compassion for others. But we have to see that some beings, if they aren't experiencing that level of suffering, then we're not going to have compassion necessarily for them. So let's look at these in terms of the one I want to emphasize out of all of this. It's on this addendum is the 3 types of suffering that's in the center of the screen there. And again, for each of these, I put some footnotes with some passages in Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. I can't think of where else liberation, liberation, liberation. Yeah, they're all from Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. Okay. So if you are curious about these and you have the copy of that book, you can certainly go there for more research on these. But this is a structure that is used frequently to get at every level of dissatisfaction that beings experience. The first is the more evident one. Again, this called here the suffering of suffering. I sometimes call it the dukkha of pain. These are the experiences of pain or anguish that are clearly unpleasant and unsatisfactory. Even animals identify this as suffering, right? They avoid what will bring them any pain or discomfort or anxiety or stress or whatever. The prairie dogs down, and do you have a lot of prairie dogs up here too?
Of course.
Yeah. Of course. I know in Santa Fe, I go by places all the time where I see them, but for some reason I don't notice them as much here. Maybe they're, but as soon as like a prairie dog sees, something like a shadow of a bird or something, a predator bird overhead, they start making a racket to let all the prairie dogs know, and they all go down in their holes and what have you, right? They get it. They get the suffering of suffering, right? They get that they don't want to end up being the meal to one of these, raptors. They want to, definitely avoid that. So that one's really evident and obvious. And once more, that's why I tend to use dukkha sometimes, is because when we use the word suffering, that's what we think it means. It means any physical threats to our well-being, physical things that we're experiencing, as well as mental anguish, grief, loss, what have you. Those things are pretty evidently, in the nature of suffering. The second one we can call the dukkha or suffering of change. As it says there, these are those experiences that we identify as pleasure or happiness, but are actually in the nature of suffering because they do not last, nor do they provide long-term satisfaction or freedom from our problems. They are incapable of doing that. I mean, this is why I mentioned last week that when we did Immeasurable Love, that Lama Zopa Rinpoche changed it to, may they, all beings have achieved Buddhahood, right? Because we want them ideally to attain a state where they are no longer subject to this type of dukkha. When we talk about the dukkha of change, this is everything that we experience in our unenlightened existence or unliberated existence that we call pleasure, that we call happiness. So again, if somebody's experiencing this and not seeing it for what it is, which we even tend to do, well, then we are blind to the reality of how these are simply unsatisfactory experiences that we engage in all the time and we keep going back to as if they were real sources of happiness. So let's use an example. I mean, the example that tends to be used in, I think it's in Tsongkhapa's great treatise, and my teacher in Italy used it there. And of course, in Italy, we were studying about, I don't know, 10 miles away from the Mediterranean. We were up in one of the Tuscan hills, and all you had to do was get in a car and get down to the beach if you wanted to go experience the beach. So imagine it's a day where it's not, hot, burning, blistering heat. There's, a little bit of a breeze, but it's pretty warm. So you go down to the beach and you're pretty warm by the time you get there and you jump into the water. And so you think, okay, I'm getting the happiness of being in the water. But then eventually, the water, it's not that warm perhaps, and the breeze comes and you start getting goose pimples and you need to get out and get in the sun again, right? And then you get into the sun and you lay in the sun and you take up all the heat, and then it gets too hot and you start sweating and you jump into the water to cool off. And then the water gets too cool and you go out into the sun to warm up. And this is what we call having fun at the beach, But it's not true fun. It's just switching one level of suffering for another. We begin the suffering of being in the water and the cold of the water the moment we get in it. And then it becomes more evident that it is suffering when we have to get out because it's so cold and we're shivering. And then we begin the suffering of being in the heat when we first lay in the sun. And then it becomes unbearable and we finally experience that coming to its apex. That's the nature of all of our pleasant experiences. Everything we experience is particularly through our senses. There are some things, again, we're not talking about dharma happiness here. Once more, this is what we want for others. I talked about this last week, right? That we want them to have a more stable happiness that is based on inner well-being. But anything that we are dependent upon these causes and conditions for is unsatisfactory because it's not really leading to the peace that we seek. It's only giving us some other form of suffering to substitute to seem like happiness for the time being until it becomes unbearable, and then we go to something else, right? This is the nature of all these experiences. And just check it out. I remember at the One Light of the Path retreat with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, that was one of our assignments during the break between teachings, was to, give that a good thought. Is there anything in your life, again, that is part of our conditioned existence that we go to for happiness, that has the ability to sustain happiness and bring you to greater and greater levels of happiness? I mean, think about it. I mean, this is one thing to convince ourselves of because we have to get it for ourselves, but then we also are observing others. Now, the good thing about this level of suffering is that it does open us up to seeing even beings who we would see as being happy as actually dealing with dukkha, right? They are also in a state that's unsatisfactory. We tend to look at people who aren't happy all the lives and whatever, but we know from reports that we get, from people, or if we know people like that they're not really happy at a deeper level. But nonetheless, it kind of looks like they have everything taken care of. It's kind of like the God realms in the more traditional Buddhist cosmology, right? Where everything is cushy and wonderful and delightful. But guess what, folks? Those things don't satisfy at the end of the day. You haven't really attained any greater happiness by having all those things in your life. And of course, because everything is impermanent, you have to leave it all behind anyway. Nobody gets to take even one penny with them when they leave this life, right? Your consciousness goes on. So there are a lot of meditations we can bring around this, but we have to see this reality that all those things we call happiness in our conditioned existence are of this nature. That was, again, it's a little bit harder to see. And animals, like I said earlier, they see the first one, but they don't see this one, right? They still will gravitate towards what brings them happiness, just like human beings tend to, right? We'll just keep going and grabbing at all these things, thinking that this makes me a happier person. The more I get and the more I can kind of keep that all going, well, the happier I am. Another example that I use, maybe I shouldn't spend too much time on this, but is when you're quite young and you go to like your first birthday party. Maybe there's like all these cupcakes out there, and you're just like, so excited to see all these things. Maybe you've had one cupcake before, but now there's like a whole bunch of them. And so you start eating them, thinking you're going to get happier and happier with each cupcake. And it's like by the third cupcake, fourth cupcake, fifth cupcake, you start turning green and, maybe you even get sick, right? Because they don't bring any greater happiness. Just like laying in the sun. You can't keep laying in the sun and expect that the initial feeling of getting in the sun from being in the cold of the water is going to keep going on. It gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and eventually it's unbearable and you have to get out of the sun. That's just the nature of all of our experiences. The last one is perhaps the deepest one to really meditate on and reflect on. And by the way, I'm not going to go through all of these other ones, so we don't have to spend too much time talking about suffering tonight. But this third one, Lama Zopa would call this pervasive compounding suffering, like when you have a compounding interest account or something where it keeps compounding the interest on top of what you had before. His idea behind that was that we just keep creating more and more causes for our suffering by being under the control of these factors. This is our very existence in samsara. Samsara being cyclic existence, going from life to life under the control of these factors. That is due, of course, to our minds being under the control of our karma and our delusions. So this is the one we have to get in regard to any being that we're observing, but especially with regard to ourselves. Is that even if we feel like, I'm okay, you're okay, everything's fine, it's a wonderful day in the neighborhood, whatever, it's not. I remember when very first teaching I ever had from Lama Zopa Rinpoche in December of 1996 at Secheng in San Francisco. He said a lot of things, and I got just the bits and pieces of it because his teaching at that time, sometimes later even, was really quite challenging to get his English. But the one teaching that he said, there are no vacations in samsara. And that one really stuck with me. And of course, I've heard him say it a few additional times at teachings. But this is the reality. There are no vacations in samsara. We are in the prison of samsara 24/7. Because even if you go on vacation, you go to a wonderful place, go to the island somewhere, Hawaiian Islands, Caribbean Islands, wherever, go to this idyllic place with the breeze being nice and the beautiful trees and the beautiful color of the water and whatever, you're still in samsara. You took your baggage with you that you didn't even have to pack. It was already there. It's always with you. You're bringing your delusions, your karma with you. And sometimes people go on vacation and they have a worse time than they do in their everyday life, right? Because that still could play out, right? There are no vacations. You don't get one moment of freedom from things in samsara. So this one, Rinpoche would use that analogy of a prison often. He'd say, this is like, that's why he called it compounding. Because he said, essentially, let me take it off screen here. Sorry, all you folks at online are just having to look at that. He would say, like, you are in prison, and while you are in prison, you keep adding to your prison sentence, essentially. Every lifetime, you keep adding to your stay in samsara. But of course, this is the big news that the Buddha taught in the remaining, noble truths. The third truth in particular, you can be an end to all this nonsense. And the end comes, of course, by practicing the fourth noble truth, the path, that leads to removing the causes of all of this. The causes of it are delusions and karma, and they can be uprooted. Especially the root delusion of ignorance can be removed, and everything, of course, is based on that is afflictive in nature. All of our attachment, our anger, our jealousy, our pride, all of those are rooted in this root ignorance. Remove that, and the whole house of cards topples, right? Nothing left. So again, this is the good news that the Buddha taught, of course, is that this can be rectified, but we have to see that this is a situation, again, that we are in. Yes, there's a suffering, that peak, kind of tip of the iceberg that we can see really evidently. Oh, that's suffering. And that's bad enough. We recall the life story of the Buddha, as Prince Siddhartha. As Prince Siddhartha, he was taken out to, these various towns, and the king tried to make it look like they were just like the palace because the Prince Siddhartha was quite interested in what happens outside the palace walls. But he saw three things that shocked him. Someone who was aged, someone who was ill, and then a funeral procession with a corpse. So he saw illness, aging, and death, and that was enough for him to develop some level of renunciation and say, hey, folks, this isn't satisfactory. We're all subject to these things. How horrible. I mean, so again, he came in through that first level of dukkha, to see the unsatisfactory nature of birth, aging, illness, death. And we are involved in that not all the time in terms of what we are experiencing at a particular moment, but that is part of the whole process. And the Buddha said, this is unsatisfactory. I have to find freedom from this. So again, this is the whole purpose of meditating on these things in this context, is to generate the compassion for others who we see are in the same predicament as ourselves. Can see that their situation is no different than mine, regardless of what their life looks like. Again, they may be the richest person on the planet. We can all think of him, richest person on the planet, still in the same state that we're all in. No difference in that regard. Absolutely no difference. So again, just to go back to the sheet, I'm just going to introduce you to these remaining things that you can meditate on as well to get some clarity about the various ways the Buddha taught dukkha. The 6 types of dukkha, which are kind of interesting one to do. I won't go into all of that, but there's uncertainty, things not being definite about existence, but to existence. Who's your friend? Who's your enemy? Who's your stranger? All that kind of stuff, as well as the situations we find ourselves in. The undercurrent of dissatisfaction, that second item, that is always there, not really getting exactly what we need. Repeatedly having to leave bodies because we die and go and exit this life after taking care of this body for so long, and then we have to get reborn again and again. This is the 4th one. Then moving from high to low over and over again within the various realms of samsara. We've been in every single one of them, going up, going down, going all over the place. There's no realm that we have not been in. And then suffering of having no companion. This is an interesting one. We're essentially alone. In samsara, there are no real companions per se. We have beings who, we can hang out with for a while, but zip, we go off and they go off or whatever, and we may not meet them again for who knows how many lifetimes. We're essentially going on from life to life alone. And in this life, even while we might have others around us, we are essentially alone. These are the way the Buddha taught the dukkha, the first noble truth, in the very first discourse that he gave. He taught these 8 types of dukkha. The first 4 I've already mentioned: birth, aging, illness, death. Being separated from what is pleasant and having to meet with what is unpleasant. And then, of course, seeking the things we desire, but not finding them. I don't need to make any commentary on any of those. We experience some of those every day, right? Desiring to get something we want and being thwarted in getting it. Having to meet with what is unpleasant. Somebody who we don't like, yelling in our face or whatever. The last one, H, there is the suffering of the contaminated aggregates. This is the fact that we have kind of a body and mind that are appropriated, that are contaminated by our delusions and ignorance. And we're never really free from that. At the end of this life, our consciousness will cease to be connected to this body, go on to another existence, goes into the intermediate state, finds through the force of karma another body, goes with that embodiment with a different gross level of consciousness. This is the one thing to remember. We say kind of appropriating consciousness. We don't appropriate consciousness in its entirety. There is consciousness as the thread that kind of goes through all of this from lifetime to lifetime. And that's what connects all of our lives together is, the prior life, the life prior to that, and so on, that same thread of consciousness came through those and is in this life. But you have a different consciousness as a dog than you do as a human, right? And we can see that from observing dogs. They've got different sensory capacities than we do, right? They can hear sounds that we can't hear with the dog whistles, right? They can smell things that we can't smell. So again, there's a lot of, and of course, their mental consciousness is very underdeveloped compared to a human mental consciousness. Can sit there as when Stella's here with Zia. I mean, we can have Zia in the room and Zia can be receiving all these teachings, but Zia's like, or Zia is just kind of doing whatever and being distracted in her dog way. She's not able to really take the teachings in completely, right? Because she doesn't have a human consciousness. So again, we appropriate these aggregates. This is the 8th level of this presentation of 8 forms of dukkha that we have to get, that there is a suffering involved just in being in this process. It's very similar to that 3rd type, the pervasive condition suffering. The last thing that I have on that addendum is this idea of observing the various realms. And Rinpoche was always very keen on this. Like, think about the suffering of the hell beings, the suffering of the pretas. Again, these are all delineated in great detail, especially in Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. If you've got the stomach for it, it's quite challenging to think about the way beings are suffering in such gross ways and really horrific ways. And we've been in those states, so we get it for ourselves that we've actually had that experience. But moreover, we see that there are beings right now, and that's where the largest proportion of beings, or largest portion of beings, are in samsara, is in the lower realms, the hells, the pretas. The hells has the greatest. The pretas are said to be the next most populous, and then the realm of animals. And of course, we're not just talking about the animals that we have in this world. The Buddha said there are many world systems and there are animals in a variety of realms. But we can't even get our heads around how many animals are in this existence that we have in this world. And then human beings are said to be less than that, demigods less, and gods even less. So the preponderance of beings are in the lower realms. And you can read about all the sufferings of these beings, even in the God realms, although they have a pretty idyllic life. They do suffer by virtue of having to part from that idyllic existence. Every time I hear about the God realms, it reminds me of when I was growing up Catholic and they would say, you want to end up in heaven. It's a heaven-like realm where you think everything is hunky-dory and you're going to be able to stay there for eternity. What happens, they say, in the last 7 days of your life as a God is that everything changes. Your body begins to wilt and have a bad smell, and kind of everything deteriorating. Garlands that you had on you are no longer beautiful. Other gods don't want to hang around with you because you start being undesirable or whatever. They say the mental suffering that you go through in those last 7 days of your God existence are the worst mental suffering in all of samsara. Physical suffering, yeah, the hell realms have it beat. Mental suffering, this is the worst. And it breaks my heart because I think of all these beings that if this is what it all is, I don't know, I don't have that knowledge. And these beings are going off to something that they think is an eternity in heaven. And it's not, it's going to, go the other way. So again, we have a lot of different realms of existence that we can look at and kind of understand their suffering. Any questions on those various sufferings? Because the compassion part of it is kind of easy compared to observing the suffering. Observing these various sufferings is important so that we gain an appreciation for the varieties of ways that beings are in an unsatisfactory existence. Anything? Anyone? Yes, please. Anne Marie.
I think you need to add, or I would add about detachment. Our detachment from getting what we think we should have or what we want, and also, and detachment, the idea, many people who die is they're ready to die. And at least one woman I know who has had a near-death experience said it's an incredible loving experience. So, you can look forward to that.
And it may be in that phase of it, but we don't, of course, know what beings go through when that ends and their consciousness goes on. And it could, again, based on their karma, be doorways to unbelievable suffering.
Well, yeah, I don't really accept that.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I've heard over and over that people who have near-death experiences have a great experience of love.
Yeah, and I'm not denying that may be the experience in the death process. What I'm getting at, though, is that when the consciousness has left the body, so that they're not coming back and talking about it, and they go on under the control of their karma, they could experience realms of unbelievable suffering.
Well, I guess, I'm sort of sticking with the detachment thing and the idea that, being in prison would be an awful, awful thing.
Right.
And people have isolation and stuff like that in this for years. That at some point they have to let go of all the feeling that they're suffering and look for, ways that they can have some more satisfaction.
Sure.
I think certainly meditation is part of that.
Yeah. And again, and in Buddhism, of course, what the Buddha taught in the Four Noble Truths is that there's a way to be free of all of it. And again, to not have to go on to another existence and to have an end to samsara, an end to this unsatisfactory state that we're in, this dukkha. So again, it's just, again, it's different things that we have to, again, continue to work with the teachings and develop our own ascertainment of what the Buddha taught and what it really means, the ramifications of it. Because in my estimation, again, we can't always see everything because we're only going to see things up to a certain point. And then after that, it becomes something we're not aware of. And so what happens after death, of course, Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism in particular is a very kind of detailed process of what occurs in the intermediate state going into the next existence and so on. That's all dictated in Buddhist terms by karma. And if we've created, even if we've had a wonderful life in this life and done things pretty well, there's no guarantee that we're going to end up in a good existence. That's what's, just unfortunate about the whole thing, because we're under the control of these other factors. We're under the control of things that are not something that we are in charge of until we begin to do the work, like you said, to do the meditation, to do the practice, to get the realization so that we then can be more in charge of the process. They say bodhisattvas continue to be reborn. I was talking about earlier how we have those different levels of compassion and concern for others, ruler-like, ship's captain-like, shepherd-like. Bodhisattvas make the determination to continue to be involved in samsara and take rebirth through the force of compassion, not through the force of their karma. Yeah, there's a good karmic seed that is ripening, but it's through this motivation of compassion that they continue to take rebirth in samsara and to benefit others, to develop all the way to Buddhahood. So again, it takes a lot of mental training, in my estimation.
I agree with the mental
Yeah.
training. But I also want to go back to the beach with you, where you get warm and you get cold and stuff. But there's a great amount of pleasure in getting from cold to warm.
Yeah.
There's a great amount of pleasure from getting warm and to the cold. And of course, splashing around is a lot of fun.
And again, Buddha would not have a problem saying that that's a pleasurable feeling, but he's just saying it's not true pleasure. It's not lasting happiness.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. That's why it's called the dukkha of change, because it changes. If we could find something that we could rely upon, put all our money on that. And that's what Buddha says, is you can rely upon his path. His path will take you to a place where it will not have this variation to it. You can experience the peace in the mind that will always be there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a nice alternative to this kind of back and forth, but sure.
But all this kind of feels like a threat to me. And I think the whole idea of being a Buddhist and doing Buddhist things is learning to be happy with where you are. And the threats are not, well, they're not convincing for one thing.
But yeah, I guess it depends upon our outlook. But again, I don't think the Buddha would want us to see it as a threat. I think if someone came to you and said, you were in your house and you hear a knocking on the door and they say, hey, your house is on fire, would you think that they're threatening you? They're telling you what you need to know so that you can get to safety. That's what the Buddha's doing in these teachings. He's saying, guess what? Things are not right. And you need to get to a place that I don't know. I need to finish up the teaching here, but let me, about this more at another time. But I think it is important that we see the right way to frame the teachings, so that we don't take them in these ways that might seem like, because I had an experience when I was trying to talk to my brother when I was very back in the beginning of my initial study about the First Noble Truth, and he couldn't get it at all. It was like, what are you talking about? I'm not suffering. There isn't. Everything's fine. And of course, he had just been complaining about everything in his life shortly before that. But, this is the reality, is that we have to kind of get the frame the teachings in the right way so that when we approach them, we understand them. And of course, it was my fault that I didn't frame them in the right way for him. And I always have to be mindful of that to make sure that we see these teachings in the right light. This is the Buddha's compassion, extended to us and saying, guess what, folks, this is not a great situation that you're in, and I can help you get out of it, right? How wonderful. So again, I've got the steps essentially are identical to what we looked at the last time in terms of we start off with generating compassion for ourselves. Self-compassion is a really hot topic in Western psychology even these days. Wonderful resource out there by Kristen Neff called Self-Compassion. Her book, as well as her website, has a lot of interesting stuff. But of course, you first look at the fact that you're the same as all these beings and wanting to be free and from suffering and the causes of suffering. That second bullet point, generate an attitude of compassion for yourself, remembering that first of all, get in touch with that fundamental wish that you possess, the desire to be free from suffering and its causes. And recognize again that this is something you share with all beings. Feel this sincerely. Do not think that it is somehow wrong to feel this way. Instead, see it as your right as a living being to be free from all suffering. This is our birthright, in a sense, to have that freedom. Acknowledge your potential to experience true freedom from all forms of suffering, keeping in mind, again, the various types that we talked about, especially those three. They're really kind of the encapsulation of everything the Buddha taught on dukkha. And then number 4 there, give yourself the space to fulfill that potential, truly wishing yourself to be free from suffering. And then you again make those same sorts of thoughts, those affirmations like we made around the metta meditation last week, loving kindness, as well as I didn't really do that in the process of today. But the idea is that we want to start with ourselves and wishing ourselves to be free from suffering, to not have any pain and sorrow, to be free from all the causes of suffering, what have you. Whatever thoughts work for you. And then imagine yourself in this state of freedom, peaceful, joyful, full of positive energy to benefit others in the world. As you make that strong affirmation towards yourself, imagine those things being removed. So the self-compassion is important. If we don't start with ourselves, just like we have with equanimity and loving kindness, it's very hard to extend them to others. Then going on to the 3 groups, that's the next phase of this. Start with friends, move on to strangers or neutral people, finally with enemies. Recall once more equanimity before engaging in that so that you see others as much as possible through that even-mindedness. Extend compassion to each of the 3 groups by recalling the ways that they suffer in addendum 2. But of course, you can also recall the kindness that they've shown you, as we did last week with addendum 1, right? That this additional thing kind of helps us feel concerned about the suffering of others. Recall that there are some people, no doubt every one of us has people in that category of enemies, that we might not feel compassion for them when they're suffering. We might even take joy in their suffering. We have that Schadenfreude, as it's called, like, oh, something's wrong with them. Oh, goody, right? Because we don't like them. We'd rather that they suffer than keep doing what they're doing or whatever. So again, we have to feel some appreciation of the kindness from those beings. Even the difficult people, we once more, as we saw last week, can be seen through the lens of showing us some measure of kindness. So we then go on, of course, to use the same sorts of thoughts that we talked about in regard to ourself. Whoops, getting used to this computer. Okay. The wish for them to be free from suffering and its causes, occurs in a similar way as when working with oneself. So we begin with those who are friends. We think about those who are very dear to us and generate those thoughts. May you be free from suffering. May you find freedom from all forms of dukkha. May you be free from the causes of that, free from your ignorance, free from your attachment, your anger, your hatred. All these sorts of thoughts we can have towards others, and again, advance it out to all the various groups of beings, friends, strangers, and enemies. And then you go on to the general one of cultivating that compassion for all sentient beings. Again, see them through the light of these 2 that we've gone through, the points for meditating on their suffering, the points for meditating on their kindness, and then cultivate immeasurable compassion using the prayer that we recited at the beginning of tonight. And this one, Lama Zopa didn't change because, of course, if we really think about dukkha in the way that it's presented that we went through today, well, then it does include everything that is keeping beings bound in samsara. It's not just gross suffering. When we hold that thought of compassion in that immeasurable prayer, we're not just wishing for beings to be free of hangnails and, headaches and, all the things, thumbs that are showing Will. Thumbs that got injured in accidents, all the various things that we have that are that form of suffering, we want them to be free from everything that is unsatisfactory. But you can even include in this, of course, the fact that there are some subtle imprints that are still in the mind, even when you removed all of those causes of dukkha. That's the subtle imprints that help, when you remove those, you become a Buddha. Again, we'll maybe touch on those at another time. But the idea here is that we want to extend our wish for freedom from suffering to include all forms of what is unsatisfactory, what is a part of the unenlightened existence that we know from our own experience and that we can see in regard to others. So any other comments or questions on tonight? Got a few more minutes left. Wanted to at least allow another opportunity for anyone else online? Anything? No. I want to share one quote with all of you then, before we do some conclusion to tonight. This is from Kunu Lama Rinpoche. Kunu Lama Rinpoche, he is the one renowned for having taught the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, Shantideva's text, the Bodhisattva's way of life, to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He's the one who imparted a lot of the commentary on that to His Holiness. So His Holiness teaches on that text quite frequently. But there was a quote I saw on the internet, and I don't know if this is actually from him or not, but he says it's this simple. Whoever we encounter either did realize reality or did not. Okay, now by reality, we mean that deepest truth that will undermine the whole process, right? I was talking about that earlier. If we get to the root of ignorance and we undermine that, well, then all the delusions built on that, all the karma we've created on the basis of that, all of that becomes dismantled, and you attain nirvana, you attain peace. And of course, when you remove these subtler imprints I was talking about, these subtler obscurations, then you also go on to become a Buddha, fully enlightened. So anyone we meet has either realized reality or they haven't. It's kind of a nice thought to have, like, okay, anyone you meet on the street, anywhere you go, any person that's appearing on your computer screen, appearing on the television, appearing here, there, they've either realized reality or they haven't, okay? Does everyone agree that that's the case? If they did realize reality, then they stand on their own wisdom and are objects of veneration. So we should like get down on the floor and prostrate to them because they've realized reality. They've realized the key to the whole thing that the Buddha taught. What we have to eventually cultivate in order to undermine this whole process that we're involved in, that we see as unsatisfactory. So that's those beings. Okay, if they're in category 1. Category 2, if they did not realize reality, then they are immersed in suffering and are objects of compassion. So that's that simple. Either they've realized reality, they're on their way out of samsara or have completely removed themselves from samsara, or they're still caught up in the same mess that we're caught up in. They haven't realized reality and thus are only objects of compassion. Kind of can change your mind around, again, whoever you might look at. Thus, he says, goes on to conclude, nobody is a valid object of anger or derogation, and nobody can ever be abandoned from our hearts. I like that, and I try to remember it when I can, but when we are dealing with challenging, difficult people, remember that. This is either a being who's realized reality, maybe not, based on the way they're behaving and acting in the world. Well, then they fall into the other category. They haven't. So I won't prostrate at their feet, but I have to have compassion for them because they're in that fundamental situation. So I just like his approach to it. It's not saying anything that different than what we talked about earlier, but it's just, it's a simple thing. They have or they haven't. If they have, if they haven't, hold them in your heart. Okay, any final comments before we conclude then? All right, we have the prayer list. We're back in the Gompa. Has that made its way around? Yes, it's there. Alexia has it. So I'm going to turn the camera on Jana, if you don't mind, so she can do this.
Dedicate the merit created by listening to this teaching to all beings everywhere on every prayer list. We're also dedicating for all those experiencing obstacles, specifically John, Mary Jo, Matt, Jeff Cochran, Ann Twain Martin, Ida, May Bond, Wyatt, Terry, Jana, John A., Devana Manuel, Christy Lang, Carolina Perez, Yadira Rodriguez, Alyssa Petrov, Carly Howard, Josh Murphy, Elizabeth Norris, Dominique Lauren Fresquez, Carolina Apodaca, Julian Cisneros. We're also dedicating for those experiencing illness, specifically Bill and Patty, Rolf, Taryn A, Yolanda, Jane, Dorcas, Jill, Mishan, BL, Westover, Steve Handlos, Kendra Toth, and David Doyle. For those who have died recently or who are dying, all beings affected by the tornadoes, Lori, Simon Tate, Kate Lockwood, Ella, Mexican Gray Wolf, Connie Mona Lee, Adam Muhammad, Monica Silvers, Emily Pike, Latai Tonga, Ali Rasmussen, Jesus Cantania, Zoe Holland, David Durant, Connie Paprika, Mike Flood, Pope Francis, Daniel Halleck, Shoni J, and Lou Mogenberg.
Are there any others that need to be added to the list? Mention. Stella, did you have one?
Can you put my name on for illness, please?
Yes,
Oh.
Stella.
We'll pray for you, definitely, Stella.
Thank
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Jenna, for reading the list. Let's go ahead and do our dedication prayers then, keeping in mind all of these beings, wishing for them to be free from the suffering that they're experiencing and to find all the causes of happiness.
Dedication prayers once in Tibetan. Gewadi
Nududak Lama Sa Drugyorne Drowachi Mahalupa Dei Sala Goparsho Samchogrin Poche Ma Ke Panam Ke Gurchik Ke Wanyam Pa Me Payam Gong Ne Gong Du Pelwar Sho.
Long life prayers for His Holiness Dalai Lama.
Granting wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled.
And what are we just same exact prayer for Rinpoche?
Same exact prayer. We'll just keep saying this I don't know if they'll do it after they find his reincarnation, but the purpose we can think is not just to identify and locate Rinpoche's reincarnation that supposedly has happened in Nepal, but then for everything to be auspicious, for him to be able to continue to be a being in this world that we can benefit from and others can benefit from. So that's the idea, I think.
Okay,
so
a prayer for the swift return of Longzor Rinpoche.
Fearless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Great. Thank you, Jana, for leading that, and everyone for joining in for the class then. course, the prayers at the end. And I will see you next Thursday. Hard to believe we're at my last teaching for this spell of providing you teachings, but then you have Geshe Sherab coming in 2 weeks. So you've got lots of good news on the horizon. So anyway, if you get a chance again to work with compassion over the next week, to read the prayer at least on occasion, do some of the meditations, self-compassion you can do if you wish, compassion for the 3 groups, compassion in a more general way for all beings, whatever works for you. But I think it's important just to spend a little time on each of these after the classes, and then we'll reconvene and talk about immeasurable joy next week. So thank you all.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Don.
Thank you,
Don.
everyone. Okay.
Thank you.
Blessings to you all. Okay. Bye-bye.